Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the October 2009 issue of Reason Wizardry. This issue is going to be a little bit different. If you saw the last issue, it was pretty intense, pretty advanced stuff, and it looked like we were going to continue on right from that point on audio processing, but I'm going to save that continuation of audio and CV processing for next month in November. Instead, I'm going to go with something a little bit different. Actually, I'm going to give almost the same presentation I gave at the Propellerhead Producers Conference in August for you guys. Probably next to none of you were there, so this is going to be new material for you. Basically what this issue is going to be about is synthetic percussion, and we're going to use synthetic kits as an example. We're going to talk about how synthetic kits sequences and how synthetic kits patches were made. And I'm going to go beyond some of the concepts that I originally gave in the presentation, because I think you guys are generally more advanced than the audience that I had at that time. So I'm going to go through the original presentation, and then at the end there's going to be some additional advanced techniques. So first off, I'm going to quickly describe what synthetic kits is. Synthetic kits is a refill made by us, Nucleus Sound Lab, that uses Reason's synth devices, Thor, Maelstrom, and Subtractor, to create drum and percussion sounds. No samples are used whatsoever in the refill. The main goal of synthetic kits is to create patches that don't sound like standard 808 or 909 electronic drums, but instead to create new sounds using Reason's synths. The second important aspect of synthetic kits is that each patch is a combinator that comprises a complete kit of drum sounds. You can play it back like a standard general MIDI kit from your keyboard. I'm going to just play a few notes here. Off this patch we've got called Hillside Radar. Or you could use the built-in patterns of each patch and use synthetic kits like a set of drum loops, essentially. Most patches have at least 4 patterns inside that are unique. I'll give you a quick demo of what that sounds like. So you can see here we've got one rotary mapped to the drum pattern. I like that drum pattern. One for the bass pattern and one for the lead. And then just some additional controls. So now let's open up the combinator. So the first part I'm going to concentrate on is pattern playback, how it works. One of the common questions I get asked is, why is there a Redrum device if no samples are used in these patches? So I'm going to answer that first. There's 2 main ways to sequence drum sounds inside a combinator. The first is to add a matrix pattern sequencer for each drum device. So you'd have one matrix controlling the kick drum, one controlling the snare, one for the hi-hat, etc. The second is to add a single Redrum device to the patch and use that to sequence everything. To do that, you need to flip the Redrum around, just minimize things there, and you use the gate out CV to trigger different devices. So you could trigger your kick from channel 1, your snare from channel 2, your hi-hat from channel 3, all the way up to 10 different devices. So to demonstrate this from scratch, I'm going to create a new patch that uses Redrum and matrix sequencing. Now I've got a basic combinator open that has 3 synthetic kits Thor patches inside. It's got a kick, a snare, and a hi-hat. So we're going to sequence these in those 2 different ways I already mentioned, Redrum and Matrix. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because I have a feeling you guys will either easily grasp it or you might already be using this first technique. So we'll need to add a matrix for each Thor. And by selecting the Thor first and then creating the device, that'll auto route up the cables behind so we don't have to manually route the CV signals. So now I'll just blank out these patterns and we'll quickly create a pattern on pattern 2. Okay, so we're going to just map that to the first rotary here, choosing whether we want either the empty pattern or pattern 2. So for each matrix, we'll need to go in and go pattern select 0 to 1, because of course 0 is actually the first pattern. Okay, so now this knob is controlling whether we're on the second pattern or the first pattern, which is empty. So now you could go ahead and add more patterns. I may have mentioned this before, but the more patterns you add, the more difficult it is to switch between them in a live setting, because here, you know, I've got 2 patterns, so I can pretty much assume that totally left is going to give me pattern 1, and totally right is going to give me pattern 2. Now if I had 8 patterns or 10 patterns, you'd have to hunt through very carefully to find each one. So 4 or 5 is pretty much the max that I'd recommend. Okay, so that's the basics of using matrix devices to sequence your drums. So I'm going to get rid of these matrix devices. And now I'm going to discuss how to sequence them with a redrum. Alright, so now we have our same 3 patches here, and I'm going to add a redrum to sequence all of them. So I'm going to create the redrum, flip it around, and we're going to use the gate out CVs to trigger each redrum. So now, if we click the preview buttons here, you can hear that they're playable right from the redrum, and that'll extend to the patterns as well. So we'll do another quick pattern here on the redrum. So you can see that's much quicker to set up sequencing like that. So now I'm going to just talk about the pros and cons of using both approaches. So with Redrum, you have some limitations, and the main one is velocity. So you've only got hard, medium, soft velocity. So when you move to using separate matrix devices, you have that really fine level of velocity detail that you can program in. The second thing, I'm going to just add some matrices here, even though they won't be connected, just for a visual reference. The second thing is that since we're using separate sequencers, we can set them at different timing and step amounts. So we could have our kick running on a 32-step sequence, say 16th note resolution, whereas our snare is running maybe at 14 steps at a 16th note resolution, and our hi-hat is running at 30-second notes. So this way you can get interesting polyrhythms that just aren't possible by sequencing everything up with one single redrum that's limited to one amount of steps and one step resolution. But on the other hand, you've got the flam control on the redrum, and you've got 64 steps. So even though to access those 64 steps, you've got to click through 16 steps at a time, you do have 64 steps, whereas the matrices are limited to 32. I did talk about a way in the last issue, I believe, to overcome the 32 step restriction in the matrix, but it's still out of the box, only capable of 32. The final comparison I'm going to make between Redrum and matrix sequencing is the setup required to play these patches back manually, and there is a difference there. So now let's consider Redrum sequencing and what to do if we want to be able to play this Redrum sequenced patch manually from the keyboard starting on C1. Okay, so we've got the programmer open. All we have to do is turn off the receive notes on each Thor device. That means that when we press a MIDI key, it's just being sent to the Redrum, and the Redrum already has its CV signals split up based on the key you press. So now C1, C sharp 1, D1. So that's all there is to it. It's all kind of pre-mapped for you since you're using a Redrum. Now, if we were going to use matrix devices, it would be more complicated because we'd actually have to set up the key splits ourselves. So we'd have to go to the first Thor, which is the kick drum, and we would have to restrict it to just one note of key range. So we'd go to C1 as the low and C1 as the high. And similarly for the next Thor, we'd go to C sharp 1 and C sharp 1. And then D1 and D1. So that's quite a bit of extra work if you are creating a patch like this. So that's something to keep in mind. And if you don't do that, your patches are going to be a hassle to play back manually. So overall, I'd say that using matrices is much more flexible and it's capable of a lot more, but it definitely adds to the complexity of your patch. The time that you're going to spend working on it to perfect it is going to be higher. Both great techniques, and you'll find a lot of synthetic kits patches that use both techniques. Oftentimes, some kit elements need the extra resolution and detail provided by a matrix, and others you can get away with just using a redrum. Now we're going to talk about creating some percussion and drum sounds using Thor and Maelstrom. So we're going to start by creating a kick. We're going to use Thor, and we're going to start off here with a sine wave. We'll pitch it down. Okay, so now you hear like a dead kick. It's dead because it has no pitch envelope. A pitch envelope is pretty crucial no matter how you're synthesizing your kick to add some impact to it. So it's pretty simple to set up the pitch envelope. We use mod envelope as our source, oscillator 1 pitch, increase the amount, and speed it up. Okay, so that's not a bad starting point. That's really like a classic electro kick, really simple. Now we're going to spice that up a little bit with some of Thor's features, like a comb filter. A comb is pretty nice to add some attack click to the kick. So kind of the beater hitting the drum if you use the right settings. If you use anything low, like to the left of 12 o'clock, it's not going to really improve the sound. You can hear right of 12 o'clock, it kind of fattens the sound and adds a little bit of attack. You can also get some interesting kick sounds by using higher drive settings on the comb filter. Another way to add a different sound to your kick is to run it through a shaper. What tends to happen when you do this, though, is it kills a lot of the bass. So let's listen to a kick run through a shaper here. So that's a good example. All the bass has been basically taken out of that kick. There's a fairly simple way to get that bass back. The way to do that is to use a parallel signal path. So right now we've just got our signal path going oscillator 1, filter 1, shaper, amplifier, and out. So we can create a second path by using the filter 2 path. So we'll click here, which will also send oscillator 1 to an empty filter 2, and we'll click there, which will send it directly to the output. So our bass is back, but we also have that drive from the shaper. That's because now we have two parallel paths. The top path is our driven path, and the bottom path is essentially our dry path. You can control the amount of driven sound by using the drive parameter on the comb filter. Okay, so we'll stop there with our kick. Now we're going to create a snare using Maelstrom. I'm assuming you probably already know about grain table synthesis, but I'm going to give a really quick primer in case you don't. Basically, a grain table is a sample sliced up into tiny bits. We can call those bits grains. Then they're played back, and you can control some parameters of how they're played back. The motion parameter controls how fast they're played back. The index parameter controls their starting point. The shift parameter controls the formant of the playback. And then you can also adjust the pitch, which is independent of the speed. So, using these parameters, we can use some of the small grains in some of the samples that you wouldn't expect and find some drum and percussion-like sounds. One of the best ones I've found for snare sounds is thunder. Thunder is a pretty chaotic, loud sample with lots of transients, and that's exactly what you need for a snare. So let's just hear what it sounds like on its own. So the first thing we want to do is make it a much shorter, less sustained sound, snappy like a snare. So that's more of a snare envelope shape. Now what we can do is scroll slowly through the index parameter and find the most snare-like sound. That's not bad. So there's many different possible points that you could stop at in this index parameter. I'm going to try that. I'm going to pitch it down. And just speed it up a little bit with that motion parameter. And we'll add a little bit of reverb on the end. Not bad at all. And another plus of this technique is it's really easy to use. And there's so many different samples that you could use depending on the sounds that you want to make. You can create a lot of percussion and drum sounds quite easily and quickly using Maelstrom. Our kick and snare are done, so now I'm going to show you how to make a quick hi-hat using Thor. Hi-hats are even easier to synthesize than kicks. There's nothing fancy about a simple electronic hi-hat. It's just a noise with a short decay. But one interesting technique with Thor is stereo hi-hats, so I'm going to show you that now. First, we need 2 noise oscillators. Now, if you've ever flipped the Thor around, you'll notice there's a bit here about true stereo synthesis. So what I'm about to show you is somewhat similar to that, but a little bit different as well. Okay, so what we want to do is send oscillator 1 to the left side of filter 3 and oscillator 2 to the right side of filter 3. And by doing that, we'll have slightly different noise on both sides of the filter, which will give us that stereo effect. So let's get into the mod matrix using these 2 rows, and I'll show you why we have to use those 2 rows in a moment. So first, oscillator 1, filter 3, left side at 100%, oscillator 2, filter 3, right side at 100%. Okay, as you can see, if I move this amp envelope slider right now, it's not really properly affecting the sound like we want. And that's because we have to use the scale command to scale this by amp envelope. Because by routing the oscillator to filter 3, we're actually bypassing the amp envelope. So we need to put it in artificially. So that's more what I had in mind. But now if we look at this sequence that's playing back, you'll notice that it all seems to be the same velocity, even though we've got some velocity levels programmed in here. And that's because, like I said before, this amp module is being bypassed. We're skipping that to go directly to filter 3. So if we want velocity response, we have to add that in, once again, artificially using the scale parameter. So to do that, we add in voice key velocity at 100% or whatever amount of velocity response that you'd like. So now you can hear that velocity coming out. We'll remove it quick. Kind of a robotic sound there. And that's much more natural, much more what we're looking for in a hi-hat. Okay, so now that shows you why we wanted to use these 2 rows as opposed to any other mod matrix rows, because they have 2 scale slots. These rows have 2 destination slots and 1 scale. So we could use those rows, but we wouldn't be able to use any velocity response in that case. you'll find as you're getting more advanced with Thor that you're going to find specific functions that are best suited for different spots on the mod matrix. Okay, so this is a starting point that you could use to create a variety of percussion patches that are more advanced than just this simple stereo hi-hat. I'm going to show you a few of those right now. So the first really easy thing to change is to change the noise type, and we'll get a significantly different sound. And one of my favorite noise types is sample and hold. So we're going to switch both of the noise oscillators to sample and hold. So you almost have a really quick military snare there. And now I'm going to change up the sequence a bit. And increase the release time. And maybe that reminds you of something. An explosion, perhaps? Maybe from classic video games? A lot of old arcade games and early console games used sample and hold noise for sound effects of all varieties. So using sample and hold, you can create a lot of retro sounds without much effort, and also some new school sounds, depending on what you put after the noise. Okay, so like I said, that's a nice starting point for stereo noise-based percussion, and just experiment with that. Let's look at a technique to create effect sounds like cymbals, gongs, etc. These are some of the most difficult sounds to synthesize because they have so much going on. They have very complex high harmonics, and they're quite discordant. So you don't use the usual technique of making sure everything is tuned in a precise way. You want chaos in these types of sounds. So we're going to use Maelstrom for a variety of reasons, and we are going to start by dialing in a slowly decaying envelope. Now we want to start with a sample that's quite bright and is somewhat similar to what we want in the end. So I'm going to choose a chime, and I'm going to also load that chime in oscillator B. Now I'm going to offset oscillator B 1 semitone. So that's discordant, and contrary to what you might think, like I said before, that's what we're going for. That's what we need for these types of sounds. So now I'm going to send both sounds into filter B using the AM amplitude modulation parameter. So that's on its way, but it's not quite there yet. So now we're going to continue sending the sound through the filter path into filter A now, and we're going to use the AM parameter once again. So now when I'm tweaking these AM parameters on both filters, there isn't really a science to it. There may be some mathematical equations that you could apply science, but for me, it's just finding the right mix, intuitively turning the knobs until it's close to the sound you're looking for, narrowing things down. Don't forget you've also got the shift parameters to play with, as well as the tuning parameters to fine-tune your sound. So you can see now I've added some unison on the end and some hall reverb. And that's not a bad result. I'd say that falls more towards the gong than a cymbal. But you could also modify this technique for a variety of other sounds depending on the filters that you use. So we could start off with the AM filter, and then for a more metallic sound we could go to a comb filter. So those were a few quick tweaks, and that's something completely different. I might prefer that one actually. Okay, so continue on from that starting point on your own, and I'm sure you'll come up with some much more impressive patches. Finally, I'd like to show you how all these patches we've been working on come together. As we've been working on these patches, I've been programming simple audition patterns for each one. Now, if we play back all these patterns simultaneously, this is what we get. Of course, first there's the kick, the hi-hat, the gong, and the snare. I've saved this combinator for you guys to check out everything, as well as the Thor patches on their own. And that about does it for the material that I originally presented at the Propeller Heads Producers Conference in August at Montreal and Vancouver. So now I have a little bit of a bonus for you with a few more advanced patches that I didn't show at the conference, just for Wizardry subscribers. For this first bonus patch, we're going to go back to a kick drum. We're going to try approaching that with FM this time, though. FM is great for percussion because it can have an unpredictable and complex high end, which is useful for just about all percussion. So we're going to start off. I've programmed a simple pattern just using the Thor sequencer, as you can see there. So let's hear it. It's basically just a sine wave without any enveloping or anything right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some modulation from the filter envelope to the FM amount. So basically that's applying an envelope to this knob, so it's quickly decaying the FM from about halfway back to zero. We can scroll through the different mod ratios. But I settled on 4. So in addition to that, we're going to use the mod envelope to add a traditional pitch envelope effect. So that's different, but I classify that as a little bit weak. So in addition, I've got a second oscillator here. It's tuned 1 octave down. So let's add that into the mix. And we'll add some pitch envelope from the same mod envelope. And we can balance them using the mixer rotary. Now let's try some soft clip distortion. And going back to the previous kick drum, we'll use a parallel signal path to get our bass back. So now you could tweak from here in a whole variety of ways. Adding FM to the second lower oscillator. Perhaps adding a third oscillator. I prefer it with just two. Tweaking the distortion amounts and types. And then of course the envelopes themselves and the amounts. So don't forget about FM when you're creating percussion patches, and don't assume that it's so complex that you're just not going to be able to come up with anything interesting, because often without using mod matrix FM, just the FM rotary on the oscillator and some interesting enveloping and mixing, you can come up with some really interesting stuff that's different than the basic electro stuff that we went through earlier. Okay, I think I'll save that patch there for you, and you can continue on with it if you like. Alright, now to finish off, and for our final bonus patch for this episode, I'm going to show you an FM gong made using Thor. And, you know, I have a bit of trouble every month balancing out how advanced to get. I get some people telling me, you know, that was just overwhelming, and it was so much information, it was tough to get through. And then others are telling me that some of it was so basic that they had hoped to be concentrating on more advanced topics. And it's really tough to balance that. And I'm hoping for that latter group that finds things fairly basic, that, you know, a patch like this at the end is going to be something that you can hopefully learn from. Okay, so this is creating a gong in a more complex, much more complex way than we originally did using Maelstrom. So I've already partially created it. I'm going to play back a simple repeating sequence so we can hear what it sounds like, and I'll describe the signal flow, and we'll make it somewhat more complex as we go. All right. So what we've got here is the 5 signs wavetable being FM modulated at 100% by a simple sine wave generated by the FM pair oscillator. So that's not that convincing of a gong. It's kind of lacking body. It's got the high element, but not much else. I've mapped the first rotary to this AM slider, so we can change the nature of the tone just right off the bat using this rotary. So those are two distinctly different tones we've got there. Now I'm going to add a filter. Okay, that probably doesn't sound like just adding a low-pass filter, and that's because there's a bit more to it than that. I've already got set up in the mod matrix filter FM from oscillator 3 to this low-pass filter. So I've played around with the tuning, found a fairly suitable setting that I thought works well. Okay, so that's a fairly good starting point. Now I'm going to add on some unison. And some reverb, and that's really fairly high quality for a synthesized effect like this. And of course there's a range of tones we can achieve just with this slider, which, as you can see, this is where it's mapped. Okay, now the second slider says fizz, and it's mapped right there. And basically what the second slider is controlling is the dry signal path. This filter isn't doing anything. It's just there so that I can modulate its drive slider. So that basically brings in the tone that we had before we added this filter. So you can dial in how much high end you prefer. Now, the sound still isn't quite smooth enough for my liking, so I'm going to add another filter in filter 3. I really like how that comb filter at this particular setting smooths things out. Listen to it with the comb filter. And without. But they're both useful sounds, so to accommodate both of them, what I could do is set up a combinator modulation so that it would switch the filter type. But instead what I've done is actually outputted additional signals from the Thor into a mixer, so we can mix between the comb and the non-comb sound. So I'll show you how that works. Basically the amp right here, that's right before it goes into the comb filter. So what we can do is take that sound and output it to different outputs. So in outputs 1 and 2, we've got the comb sound. And in outputs 3 and 4, we've got the sound direct from the amp that hasn't been affected by the comb filter yet. And that's how I've set it up. Amp going to audio out 3 and audio out 4. So now, if I solo that output, that's the non-comb filtered sound. And there's the comb filtered sound. So I'm pretty happy with that result, but you could continue tweaking from here in a variety of ways. Actually, yeah, countless ways you could tweak from here. You could tweak the wavetable position of the main oscillator. Or even the wavetable itself. You can tweak the filter FM. That adds a bit more metallic edge. You could tweak the toning of both the FM and the filter FM using oscillators 1 and 2. I won't get into that tuning mess, I'll let you give that a shot if you'd like. And of course you can tweak the comb filter as well. So that's your advanced bonus FM gong. Okay, that wraps up this October 2009 issue of Reason Wizardry. Thanks once again for watching, and I'd love feedback on the issue as always. Next month, we're going to likely get back to the audio and CV routing that we started up with in September. And then in December or January, I'm not sure which, I'd like to run a contest where I get you guys to put into practice some of the concepts we've been going through and submit some different patches using Reason's devices. And then in whichever issue I decide on, I'd go through those patches, the winning patches, and what makes them excellent, and just go through them and describe them. So that's what I'm toying with right now. Whichever route I go with, we'll talk about that in the next issue, so there's plenty of time for you guys to prepare and hopefully submit the best patches you possibly can. So thanks, as always, for subscribing. I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.